The rain had been falling for hours, a steady whisper against the tall glass windows of the Whitmore Hotel's rooftop lounge. New York glimmered beyond, drenched in silver, its skyline blurred like a watercolor painting left too long in the rain. Inside, the air hummed with low jazz and the faint scent of aged whiskey. Layla Carter sat alone at the far end of the bar, her slender fingers curled around a half-full glass of Merlot. She wasn't there to be seen. She had chosen this secluded corner because it felt invisible, safe. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet celebration. The first night she could finally breathe after walking away from a relationship that had drained her dry. But instead of freedom, an ache gnawed at her chest, a hollow space she didn't yet know how to fill. Her dress was simple, midnight black, with a neckline that traced her collarbone, elegant without trying. Her hair, soft coils still damp from the rain, framed her face in a halo of unruly beauty. Occasionally she would glance toward the window, searching for something in the wet city lights. And then, she felt it. That gaze. It was sharp enough to cut through the low light, steady enough to make her pulse trip over itself. Layla turned her head slowly, as though she already knew who she'd find. Across the room, sitting with one elbow resting casually on the back of a leather sofa, was a man whose presence didn't belong to any ordinary night. Ethan Whitmore. Even from across the lounge, he radiated a kind of power that pulled the air tighter around him. White dress shirt open at the collar, a tailored charcoal suit that looked like it had been cut for him alone, and eyes, transparent, cold steel gray, that locked onto her with unsettling precision. Everyone in New York's upper circles knew his name. Billionaire tech mogul, dealmaker, empire builder, and if the rumors were to be believed, utterly incapable of warmth. Layla knew the type. Men like him didn't just look at you. They assessed, measured, decided. But there was something else in his stare tonight. Something almost raw. She took another sip of wine, pretending not to notice, though her fingers tightened on the stem of the glass. Across the room, Ethan's lips curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something like recognition. Their last meeting had been fleeting, months ago, at a charity fashion gala where Layla had been showing her first capsule collection. He'd passed her table without a word, only the faintest nod. At the time, she had told herself she didn't care. Now, under the weight of his gaze, she wasn't so sure. The bartender slid another drink toward her, unprompted. "From the gentleman," he said, with a discreet head tilt in Ethan's direction. Layla let her eyes flick to the glass, neat bourbon, the scent of oak and heat curling up toward her, and then back to him. She didn't raise it, didn't nod in thanks, just held his gaze across the crowded lounge, like a silent dare. Somewhere in the background, the city pulsed on without them. Cars hissing through rain-slicked streets, horns muted by the storm. But here, in this dim-lit cocoon of amber and shadow, there was only the thread between them, thin, taut, and charged with something neither dared to name. It was the moment that began with nothing and changed everything. If you've ever felt that spark, that sudden, unexplainable pull towards someone you barely know, you'll understand why Layla didn't look away. You'll understand why her world shifted before he stood and walked toward her. And, as you're here with me now, you'll want to keep following this story. Because what's about to unfold isn't just a meeting between two strangers. It's the first crack in the armor of a man who's never let anyone close, and the beginning of a choice that will cost them more than they can imagine. So, if you're already leaning in, curious about where this night will take them, stay with me. Like, comment. Let me know if you've ever felt that electric stillness in the air, and follow along. You'll want to be here for what comes next." Ethan moved through the lounge like a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he wanted. The low light caught the sharp angles of his face, the cut of his jaw, the controlled ease of his stride. No one stopped him. No one dared. Layla kept her eyes on her glass, but she felt every step he took, the subtle shift in the air, the weight of his attention pressing closer. When he stopped beside her table, she didn't look up immediately. She was determined not to be another woman who melted under the heat of that gaze. "You're drinking alone," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, low, velvety, edged with something unspoken. "What does it look like?" she replied, letting her tone land indifferent and sharp. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It looks like you're trying to forget something." "Maybe I am," she said. And for a moment, the space between them tightened, as though her words had touched something he recognized in himself. "So am I." She glanced up then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time that night. There was something dangerous about looking at him too long, like standing too close to a ledge in the dark. He didn't look away. "I should go," she murmured, setting her glass down. But even as she said it, her voice betrayed her, softer than it should have been. "Come with me." The words were simple, unhurried, but they carried the weight of a decision neither of them had made yet. She hesitated, searching his face for a trace of mockery, a hint of arrogance. But what she found instead was restraint. He offered her the chance to say no, even if part of him didn't want her to. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the loneliness curling tight in her chest. Or perhaps it was how his voice wrapped around her like a quiet promise. She stood, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor, and placed her hand in his. The elevator ride was silent, the kind of silence that hums with unspoken thoughts and pulses with tension. She was aware of his presence almost physically. The measured breaths, the warmth radiating from him, the occasional brush of his sleeve against her bare arm. The world seemed to fall away when the doors opened to the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in glittering darkness, the rain casting silver rivers down the glass. He closed the door behind them, the click echoing in the vast, quiet space. "You can still leave," he said, his voice lower now, as if testing her resolve. Layla took a breath that trembled just enough for her to notice. "I don't want to." It was all the permission he needed. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. His hands were in her hair, his mouth on hers. Urgent, searching, as if he'd been holding back for longer than either of them realized. She tasted the heat of whiskey on his tongue, felt the rough them, oblivious, as he lifted her effortlessly, pressing her against the cool glass. The contrast of heat and chill sent a shiver down her spine. His touch was unhurried, yet deliberate, mapping her like he was learning something by heart. For one night, she let herself forget the heartbreak she'd walked away from, the questions she hadn't answered. Under his hands, she wasn't a woman who had been left behind. She was wanted, seen. But even in the haze, she felt it. Something beneath his control. A shadow of hesitation. And she didn't yet know if it was about her or him. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed clean, the streets below glistening like veins of silver. Pale and tentative sunlight began to creep between the sheer curtains, spilling over the tangled sheets where Layla stirred. For a moment, she didn't open her eyes. She wanted to stay suspended in that half-dreaming state, where the warmth she felt wrapped around her could be more than just the remnants of a night she wasn't supposed to have. She could still taste his kiss, feel the weight of his hands, as if her skin remembered more vividly than her mind. But when she reached for him, The space beside her was cold. She blinked into the light, her gaze sweeping the vast expanse of the penthouse until it caught him. Ethan, already dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, standing by the window. The skyline stretched behind him, a perfect frame for the man who seemed carved out of the city. Strong, unyielding, and untouchable. He didn't turn when she sat up, the sheet clutched loosely to her chest. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than intended. "Morning." His reply was clipped, flat, without the slightest trace of the man who had kissed her like he was breaking his own rules. She studied him, searching for a thread to pull, some sign that last night had been more than just a collision of loneliness and heat. "About last night," she began. It was a mistake. The words landed like a shard of glass, sharp and clean. They cut before she could even prepare for them. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She had expected, she didn't know what. But not this. Not the deliberate way he fixed his gaze on the city as if she were nothing more than a faint disruption to his morning. "Right," she said finally, the word tasting bitter. She tried for a laugh, but it cracked on the way out. "Of course." He turned then, only to adjust his tie, his expression unreadable. "I have a meeting in an hour. Take your time leaving." Leaving. The sheet tightened in her grip. She rose quietly, each movement deliberate, as if holding herself together required focus. Her dress lay crumpled on the floor, a silent reminder of how easily she'd stepped into something she swore she wouldn't. She gathered her clothes, slipping them on without looking at him. At the door, she hesitated. Part of her, stubborn, foolish, wanted him to say something, anything, to stop her, to prove that she hadn't been just another woman passing through his carefully controlled life. But Ethan said nothing. So she left, the quiet click of the door behind her echoing louder in her chest than any slammed goodbye. The following weeks blurred together in muted tones, as if someone had drained the color from Layla's world. Work became her refuge, a small, cluttered studio where bolts of fabric leaned in corners and sketches were scattered across the table. She told herself she could lose the memory of Ethan Whitmore in the hum of her sewing machine, in the prick of pins between her fingers. But the quiet moments were dangerous. They left space for her thoughts to wander. And in those moments, she would feel it again. That ache she couldn't quite name, low and insistent, curling in her stomach. It began subtly. A wave of nausea washed over me when the scent of coffee drifted through the air. A sudden fatigue had her collapsing into bed hours earlier than usual. At first, she blamed stress, the late nights, the lingering pull of that one night she couldn't shake from her mind. Until the day she bought the test. She told herself it was only to rule out the impossible, a precaution before her mind spun into irrational places. But as she stood barefoot on the cold tile floor of her tiny bathroom, the truth appeared in two small pink lines, clear, undeniable. Her breath hitched. It was absurd, she thought, the thing that happened in novels or whispered gossip, but not to her. And yet here it was, printed on a plastic stick in her trembling hands. She bought another test, and another. By the end of the hour, 5 identical truths stared back at her. There was no mistake. Her knees gave way, and she sat on the floor, the cool porcelain of the tub against her back. One hand went instinctively to her abdomen, flat beneath her loose sweater, as if she might already feel the life forming inside. The flood of emotions came simultaneously. Shock, fear, disbelief, and something else she wasn't ready to name. She thought of Ethan, his eyes like tempered steel, and how he had said the word mistake, without hesitation. She could already hear his voice if she told him. Clinical, measured. A man addressing a problem to be managed, not a miracle to be embraced. She couldn't give him the chance to decide what this meant. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she saw Claire's name flash across the screen. She hesitated, then answered. Her best friend's warm, steady voice was a tether, but when Layla whispered the truth, there was a pause on the other end. "Does he know?" Claire asked softly. "No," Layla said, her voice breaking. "And he can't." The decision settled between them like a pact. She would do this alone, whatever it took. In the following days, she buried herself in planning, not for a collection or show, but for a suddenly heavier and more fragile future. She researched clinics. She sketched budgets on scraps of paper. She read about prenatal vitamins and remedies for morning sickness while sipping ginger tea. But the fear was always there, an undercurrent beneath every breath. How would she manage the rent? What if her clients dropped off? What if? No. She wouldn't think about the what-ifs. She couldn't. Late one night, she sat in bed, the glow of her laptop washing her face in pale light. Her appointment confirmation for the first ultrasound was open on the screen. She traced the date with her fingertip, then closed the laptop as if shutting. It could quiet the whirlwind inside her. Her hand found her stomach again. "It's just us," she whispered into the darkness. "But I promise, I'll love you enough for two." Outside, the city moved on without her. Somewhere high above, in another part of Manhattan, Ethan Whitmore was likely seated at a glass conference table, orchestrating empires with the same ruthless precision that had built his fortune. And Layla, with her secret tucked beneath her heart, prayed their worlds would never collide again. The invitation had been sitting on Layla's work table for weeks, buried beneath fabric swatches and unfinished sketches. Claire had dropped it off herself, insisting that Layla couldn't afford to miss the night industry's annual gala. "The kind of room where connections are made and careers are built," she'd said. Layla had argued. She wasn't in the mood for champagne smiles and hollow compliments. She wasn't in the mood for any of it. But Claire, relentless as always, had brushed her off. "You'll blend right in. He won't even notice you in a crowd that big." She hadn't said his name. Neither of them did. And so, on a crisp winter evening, Layla stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the deep navy gown Claire had convinced her to wear. The silk draped gracefully over her curves, the fitted bodice flowing into a skirt that brushed the floor. It concealed the slight swell of her stomach, small enough that most would miss it, but not her. She saw it in the way the fabric shifted when she moved. The ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, scattering light over the crowd like 1,000 tiny stars. Servers in black and white moved silently through the throng, balancing trays of champagne flutes that clinked gently in the hum of polite conversation. Layla kept to the edges, weaving between clusters of guests, her hand occasionally brushing her abdomen in an unconscious, protective gesture. She told herself she was only here for the connections, for the whispers of potential clients Claire had promised. And then she felt the heat of a gaze she knew too well. Her breath stilled in her chest before she even turned. Across the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore stood with a small circle of men in tailored suits, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was dressed in a black tuxedo, the cut immaculate, the bow tie perfectly in place. But it wasn't the suit that made him stand out. It was the way he carried it, the quiet command in his posture, the precision of his stillness. His eyes instantly found her, locking on with a force that made her forget the noise around them. Time didn't stop, but it slowed, the way it sometimes does in moments you'll remember forever. Layla's first instinct was to turn away, to disappear into the nearest crowd before he could close the space between them. She pivoted toward the far end of the ballroom, her fingers gathering the folds of her gown as she moved quickly toward the exit. She almost made it. A hand closed around her wrist, firm, unyielding. She turned sharply, her pulse thrumming. He stood inches from her, the crowd blurring into meaningless shapes behind him. His grip was not cruel, but it was certain. "You're hiding something," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Layla's mouth went dry. "Let me go, Ethan." He didn't. His gaze swept her face. Then, so quickly she almost didn't notice, dropped to the slight curve of her midsection before returning to her eyes. "Not until you tell me why you ran when you saw me." "I didn't run," she said, forcing her tone into something extraordinary and even. "I was leaving." One corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile. "Lying doesn't suit you." The music swelled behind them, the orchestra's strings rising like a tide. But in that moment, Layla could only hear the rush of her heartbeat. He leaned in slightly, his words brushing her ear. "What is it you're so desperate to keep from me?" She met his gaze, every muscle in her body tense. There's nothing to tell. But she could see it, the flicker of realization in his eyes. And she knew, even before he said anything else, that Ethan Whitmore had begun to put the pieces together. Ethan's hand didn't loosen around her wrist until he had steered her out of the glittering chaos of the ballroom. The heavy double doors swung closed behind them, cutting off the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses. They were now alone in a private lounge, the lighting softer, the air still thick with the faint echo of the grandeur of the gala. Layla pulled her wrist free when she could, taking 2 deliberate steps back. The silk of her gown whispered against the polished floor, the sound too delicate for the tension in the room. "Whatever you think," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "Don't pretend you don't know what I saw." Her breath caught. She wanted to argue, redirect, and wrap herself in the safe layers of distance she'd built over the past months. But Ethan wasn't leaving space for evasion. His gaze held hers, sharp as a blade. "You've been avoiding me since that night," he continued. "And now you show up here looking—" His eyes swept over her, pausing, only briefly, on the slight swell of her abdomen before returning to her face. "Different." Layla's pulse drummed in her ears. "You're imagining things." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking just beneath the surface. "I don't imagine, Layla. I see. I read people for a living, and right now, I'm reading to you." She straightened her spine. "You don't get to read me. You don't get to decide what's happening in my life." He took a step closer, then another. The distance between them felt more like a dare than a safety measure. "Then tell me I'm wrong," he said. "Look me in the eye and tell me you're not carrying my child." The air between them seemed to be still. Layla's lips parted, but no words came. Silence wrapped around them like a second skin, heavy and unyielding. Her heart was racing so fast she could feel it in her throat. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. In that moment, she realized he wasn't guessing. He knew. When she didn't answer, something shifted in his expression. Anger, yes, but threaded with something darker, almost primal. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. 5 months, she whispered before she could stop herself. His breath came in sharply, as if the confirmation had struck deeper than he'd expected. "And you didn't think I had the right to know?" Her chin lifted, though her voice trembled. "I didn't want to trap you, Ethan. You made it very clear that night was a mistake." His expression hardened, but not into the familiar, emotionless mask she'd seen before. This was different, fractured, as if something in him was breaking apart. "A mistake," he repeated, almost to himself. That's what you think I would see this as? She gave a hollow laugh, more to steady herself than anything. Isn't it? You don't love? You don't do attachment. This would be inconvenient. His eyes flashed, the steel in them sharpened by something raw. This isn't about convenience, Layla. This is about the fact that you are carrying my child, and I will not be kept in the dark about it. She folded her arms, a thin shield against the storm she saw coming. And what would you have done if I told you? Forced me into a marriage contract? Kept me hidden away so no one knew? He stepped closer again, the heat in his voice rising. You think so little of me? I think exactly what you've shown me, she said. You control everything. You calculate every move. Why would this be any different? They stood there momentarily, breathing in the same charged air, the words between them like open wounds. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness, but not its resolve. You should have told me. And what would that have changed? She asked quietly. Everything, he said. The way he said it, low, certain, made something in her chest tighten in a way she didn't want to acknowledge, because there was truth there, and truth was dangerous. The drive back to her apartment should have been a relief. Instead, Layla sat in the back of the black town car Ethan had insisted on sending, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The city lights slid by in streaks of gold and red, each flash reflected in the glass, each turn pulling her further from the echo of their confrontation. She thought she'd feel lighter now that the truth was out. No more hiding and carefully calculated evasion. But there was no relief in the air she breathed, only the heavy humming awareness that Ethan Whitmore would not simply walk away now. He didn't. 2 days later, she was standing in the quiet of her studio, pinning fabric to a dress form, when the door opened without a knock. Her pulse stumbled at the sound of his voice. We need to talk. He was framed in the doorway, every line of his suit pressed to perfection, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. She didn't move, her fingers still clutching the pin. We already talked. No, he said, stepping inside, closing the door behind him. We fought. There's a difference. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. And now you're here to fight again? I'm here to tell you what's going to happen. Something in her bristled at the certainty in his tone. You don't get to. You're carrying my child, Layla, he said, his voice cutting clean through hers. I'm not leaving that to chance. I'm not leaving you alone in this. The words struck differently than she expected, not softened, not gentle, but weighted with an iron determination. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the unwavering line of his mouth. She placed the pin down carefully, her movements deliberate. So, what's your solution, Ethan? A generous monthly allowance? A quiet arrangement to keep you out of the tabloids? Marry me. The two words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the air between them. She blinked, certain she'd misheard. What? Marry me, he repeated, as if it were the most apparent course of action. It's the only way to protect you and the baby. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Protected? That's what you're calling it? It's not about romance, Layla, he said, stepping closer. It's about stability, security. Our child deserves that. She felt her chest tighten. You're right. It's not about romance. Because you don't love me, Ethan. And I'm not agreeing to bind myself to someone who can't even say they care about me. His jaw flexed, but his voice stayed calm. Love isn't the point. It's my point, she shot back. And if it's not yours, then we have nothing to discuss. He moved closer until the faint scent of his clean, understated cologne threaded through her senses. "I'm not offering you empty promises," he said. "I'm offering my name, my resources, my protection." "And in return?" she asked, her voice low. "In return," he said, his eyes holding hers, "you stop pretending I don't matter to you." The silence that followed was jagged. Her heart was pounding, not from the offer, but from how he looked at her when he said it, as if he knew, with infuriating certainty, that some part of her cared. She turned away, reaching for the fabric again to put space between them. "You're confusing possession with mattering," she said. "And I'm not interested in being one more thing you control." His reply was quiet, but edged. "You think that's all I'm capable of? I think it's all you've shown me." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan's voice dropped, lower, almost a warning. "I'll give you time to think about it. But know this, Layla. I don't walk away from what's mine. And this child is mine." He left without another word, the click of the door marking the end of their standoff. But even after he was gone, the echo of his proposition lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding. And Layla, alone in her studio, pressed a hand to her stomach and whispered, not to him, but to herself, "It's not enough." It happened the way storms often do, not in one violent crack, but in a slow gathering of clouds until the sky was too heavy to hold them. Layla didn't agree to marry him, but she didn't refuse the sleek and black car that arrived outside her building 3 mornings later, with a driver who handed her an envelope in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. "For your safety," it read, "and the baby's." Inside was a set of keys, not to a car, to a penthouse. She told herself she wouldn't use them. She would keep the envelope sealed and the keys hidden in the back of a drawer. But 2 nights later, after a stranger lingered too long outside her apartment door, and the hallway light flickered with every step she took, she found herself standing in the mirrored elevator of the Whitmore residences, the keys cold in her hand. The penthouse was everything she expected. Glass and steel, high above the city, the view that made even New York feel small. It was pristine, almost impersonal, as if no one lived there. She wondered if Ethan had chosen it for its beauty, or because no one could reach him here without permission. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against the counter in the open kitchen, a glass of water in his hand. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't going to," she said, setting her bag down. "But things happened." His gaze sharpened, but he didn't press. Instead, he nodded toward the hallway. "Your room's ready." Your room. The word settled somewhere strange in her chest. Not our, not the guest room, just your room. It was on the far end of the penthouse, separated from his own by a long corridor. The space was warm in a way the rest of the apartment wasn't. Soft lighting, a bed dressed in cream linens, a vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. She stood in the doorway, fingers brushing the frame, wondering if he had chosen them himself or instructed someone to make it comfortable. The days that followed were strange in their quiet. Ethan's presence was everywhere. His voice in the next room during conference calls, the muted sound of his footsteps crossing the marble floor, the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway long after he'd passed. He didn't hover. He didn't question her schedule. But there was a watchfulness in him, as if he had memorized the sound of her movements and would know instantly if something was wrong. Meals became their only regular intersection. Breakfasts were short. Coffee for him, tea for her, a plate of fruit that always seemed to replenish itself no matter how much she ate. Dinner was different. He was always home for dinner. And while their conversations stayed safe, clients, the weather, her designs, there was something in how he listened, attentive, focused. It was as if each word she gave him was a piece of a puzzle he was determined to solve. And yet, the walls between them held. One night, unable to sleep, Layla wandered into the living room. The city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights below shifting like restless constellations. She was reaching for a blanket on the couch when she heard the soft sound of bare footsteps. Ethan emerged from the shadows, wearing a dark t-shirt and loose pants, his hair slightly mussed. Not the immaculate CEO, but a man pulled from his rest. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "The baby seems to think midnight is a good time for gymnastics." A flicker of something, not quite a smile, touched his mouth. "Do you need anything?" "No," she said. But when she turned back toward the window, she felt him step closer, his presence warm at her side. For a long moment, they stood there together, looking out at the city. It was quiet. Not the tense silence they'd carried for months, but something gentler. She could almost forget the way he had bargained for her presence here, the way he'd spoken of marriage as if it were a business deal. Almost. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, as if the hour demanded softness. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Layla." She glanced at him, but his gaze was fixed on the city. His profile was a study in restraint. Strong lines, unreadable eyes, a man who offered safety but kept his heart behind glass. She wanted to ask what this meant to him. He wasn't ready to admit whether it was just the child or something more, but she didn't. Instead, she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and whispered, "Good night, Ethan." He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was quiet enough that she almost thought she imagined it. Good night. The penthouse was quiet at night, in an almost unnatural way. The refrigerator's hum seemed muted, as if the space held its breath after dark. Layla had been lying awake for over an hour, staring at the ceiling, the rhythmic movements in her belly making rest impossible. Hunger joined the list of minor discomforts, sharp enough to pull her from bed and guide her, barefoot, through the long hallway toward the kitchen. She didn't turn on the leading lights, relying on the soft underglow from the cabinets. The marble countertops gleamed faintly, and the city beyond the glass walls glittered in its quiet rhythm. She opened the refrigerator, scanning shelves stocked with fresh produce, dairy in glass bottles, and the curated ingredients she imagined were chosen by someone other than Ethan. Her hand paused over a carton of strawberries, their ripe sweetness cutting through the cool air. She set them on the counter, found a small pot, and began melting dark chocolate over a low flame. The simple act, something familiar, something hers, was a rare comfort in a place that still didn't feel like home. The sound of a low footstep behind her made her freeze. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. "What are you doing up?" Ethan's voice was low, rougher than usual, like it had been pulled straight from sleep. "I couldn't sleep," she said, keeping her eyes on the chocolate as it softened into glossy swirls. The baby was making sure of that. He stepped closer, his bare feet soundless on the polished floor. "And this is your solution? Strawberries?" "Strawberries and chocolate," she corrected, glancing up just long enough to catch the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. He reached for one without asking, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief but precise, a deliberate graze rather than an accident. Holding her gaze, he bit into it slowly, the dark chocolate cracking under his teeth. She swallowed, feeling the moment in ways it shouldn't. "You surprise me," he murmured, setting the bitten fruit down as if he hadn't just undone her composure with something so simple. "How so?" "You live here now, but somehow, you still make it feel like I'm the guest." She tilted her head, unsure if it was meant as an accusation or an observation. "Maybe because you're used to owning every space you walk into." His mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but enough to register. And you don't let me own this one. She turned away under the pretense of checking the chocolate. Some things can't be owned. For a moment, the only sound was the faint simmer of the double boiler. Then she felt a light touch at the corner of her mouth. She froze. His fingers, warm and sure, brushed the skin there, wiping away a drop of chocolate she hadn't noticed. His hand lingered for a breath too long. When she finally looked at him, his eyes had darkened, the careful detachment he wore in public slipping, just slightly. "I shouldn't want you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Her pulse jumped. "But you do," she whispered. It was reckless to say it, but she couldn't take it back. His jaw tightened, his gaze holding hers for one charged heartbeat, two. Then, without another word, he stepped back, breaking the invisible line between them. The air felt colder in his absence. He turned toward the hallway, his voice steady again, but softer than before. "Don't stay up too late." And just like that, he was gone, leaving her with cooling chocolate, half-eaten strawberries, and a truth neither of them was ready to face. The rain came without warning. One moment, the city skyline was etched sharply against a steel-gray sky. The next, clouds swallowed it whole. By late evening, the wind had turned wild, rattling against the glass walls of the penthouse, pulling the city's lights into a shimmering blur. Layla had been restless all day, the kind of restlessness that settled under the skin and refused to leave. Ethan had been in and out, constantly in motion. Conference calls, meetings, moments when he'd walk past her with a quiet nod, but no words. By nightfall, she couldn't stand the stillness inside. She needed air, even if it was laced with rain. She slipped on a coat and left without telling him, taking the private elevator down the street. The storm caught her within minutes. The rain wasn't gentle. It came in sheets, drenching her hair, soaking through the fabric of her coat until it clung cold against her skin. But she kept walking, her footsteps muffled by the wind, the wet pavement reflecting flashes of streetlight. She didn't know how long she'd been out before she realized her mistake. The temperature was dropping, and the wind cut sharper with each block. Her body shivered violently, the weight of the wet fabric making it harder to move. Her fingers were numb when she finally returned to the building, and the elevator ride was a blur. She stepped into the penthouse, dripping water onto the marble floor. Ethan was standing near the fireplace, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, his head lifted when the elevator doors opened, his eyes locking on her like a target. "What the hell were you doing out there?" His voice wasn't raised, but the force in it carried more than anger. "I just needed to get out," she said, her voice unsteady from the cold. "In this?" He crossed the room in long strides, reaching for the thick knit blanket draped over the back of the sofa. Without asking, he wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. The warmth of it, and him, was immediate. His fingers brushed her damp hair back from her face, his touch almost too careful. "You're freezing," he murmured, the sharpness in his voice tempered now by something quieter. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled with the chill still in her bones. "You're not." His eyes searched hers, the kind of look that stripped away deflection. The air between them shifted. She became acutely aware of his nearness, the heat of his body through the blanket, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the storm's clean, electric air. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the glass and the low crackle of the fire. Then he lifted a hand to her cheek, his palm warm against her cold skin. "You shouldn't be out there alone," he said, quieter now. She could have argued and told him she didn't need his protection, but the way he looked at her, she couldn't find the words. There was no calculation in his eyes now, no distance, just something raw and unguarded. The world outside the penthouse seemed to vanish when he leaned in, his lips brushing hers tentatively, as if he'd been holding back for far too long. The kiss deepened quickly, all restraint slipping away. His hands drew her closer, the blanket loosening as her fingers found the fabric of his shirt, gripping it as if she might anchor herself there. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it was all heat, closeness, and the dizzying realization that neither of them could pretend anymore. When he finally pulled back, his breath was uneven, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though his voice betrayed the truth. They both knew it already had. He stepped back, the space between them suddenly too wide. Layla stood still, her lips tingling from his kiss, her heart pounding with the certainty that something had shifted, whether he was ready to admit it. 2 days passed after the storm, and neither spoke about the kiss. It lingered in the quiet spaces between them, in the way their eyes would meet and break too quickly, in the unspoken pause when they passed each other in the hall. Ethan didn't retreat into complete silence, but he didn't push forward either. He was careful. And Layla, for her part, didn't know if that was a kindness or a cruelty. It was late morning when the knock came. Layla was in the kitchen, the steam from her tea curling into the soft winter light, when she heard the low murmur of Ethan's voice in the foyer. She didn't think much of it until a second, unmistakably feminine voice cut through the air. It was smooth, deliberate, and an undercurrent of familiarity instantly set Layla on edge. She stepped out just far enough to see them. The woman stood tall in a camel wool coat, her posture as elegant as the chignon at the nape of her neck. Dark red lipstick, diamond studs that caught the light when she moved, and an expression that carried a particular kind of entitlement, like someone who had never been turned away from anything she wanted. Vivian. Layla didn't need to be told who she was. She could see it in how Ethan's shoulders had stiffened, in the careful distance between them that still carried the echo of intimacy. "Vivian," Ethan said evenly, "this isn't a good time." "I disagree," Vivian replied, her smile tight but unyielding. Her gaze flicked past him and landed directly on Layla. The pause that followed was almost imperceptible, but Layla felt it like a shift in air pressure. Vivian's eyes traveled over her, taking in every detail. The loose sweater that skimmed over her growing belly, the bare feet on the hardwood floor, the mug still warm in her hands. "So," Vivian said, turning back to Ethan, "this is where you've been hiding." "Hiding." The word lodged itself somewhere deep in Layla's chest. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked once before he said, "We're not having this conversation here." But Vivian stepped further inside, her heels clicking against the floor. "I had to see for myself," she said lightly, though her eyes never softened. "The woman who's replaced me." The air in the penthouse grew taut, as if the glass walls were listening. "I'm not here to replace anyone," Layla said finally, her voice even but cool. Vivian's smile curved without warmth. "No? Then what are you doing here? Carrying his child? Do you honestly think Ethan will ever love you? He doesn't know how. He never did." The words were too sharp, but they were delivered with such casual precision that they slid under the skin before you could feel the sting. Layla didn't flinch, but she felt the weight of Ethan's silence beside her. He hadn't stepped in. He hadn't said she was wrong, and that somehow hurt more than the words themselves. Vivian turned back to him, her tone dropping into something softer, more personal. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. You know it, deep down. This arrangement, it's not you." Something flickered in his eyes, something Layla couldn't read, and Vivian saw it too. She stepped closer to him, her voice lower now. "Call me when you're ready to come back to reality." She left without looking at Layla again. The door closed with a muted click that echoed far too long. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that demanded to be broken, but neither of them dared to touch. Layla set her mug down slowly, the sound of ceramic on marble louder than it should have been. "You didn't say anything," she said, not turning to face him. "I wasn't going to have that fight in the middle of the foyer," Ethan replied. His tone was controlled, but there was an edge, a strain she hadn't heard before. "I'm not talking about her," Layla said, finally looking at him. "I'm talking about me." "You didn't say she was wrong." His expression shifted, but only slightly. "Because you don't need me to tell you what you already know." Her breath caught at that, not because of the words, but because she couldn't tell if they were meant to hurt or to protect. Either way, they left a hollow place in her chest. The hours after Vivian's visit moved with a strange heaviness, as if the penthouse had absorbed her words and held them in its walls. Layla didn't speak to Ethan that afternoon. She busied herself in the guest room, folding laundry that didn't need folding, rearranging things she hadn't touched in weeks. Her hand would drift to her stomach occasionally, a quiet instinct to protect, not just the child, but herself. She could still hear Vivian's voice, the effortless cruelty woven into it. But it wasn't the insult that lingered most. It was the silence that followed. Ethan's silence. By evening, the city was wrapped in a cold haze. Layla stood at the window, watching the blurred lights, the mist curling up between the buildings. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of Ethan on a call, his tone clipped, controlled, the same voice he used in boardrooms. It struck her that she had never heard that voice say her name in warmth. When the call ended, he came to stand beside her. The reflection in the glass showed them both. Two figures side by side, separated by more than just the pain between them and the city. "About earlier," he began. "You don't have to explain," she cut in, her voice steady but quiet. His gaze shifted to her, but she fixed hers on the skyline. "I wasn't going to let her speak to you like that," he said, "but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene either." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You didn't need to defend me. Acknowledge me. That would have been enough." Ethan didn't reply right away. "I brought you here to protect you," he said finally. "And maybe that's the problem," she said, facing him fully. "You protect me like you'd protect an asset. Something valuable, yes, but not someone you love." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. "I told you before, Layla. I don't know how to do that." "Then I can't stay here," she said, the words coming out before she'd even decided to tell them. His expression didn't change, but she saw the shift, the faint narrowing of his gaze, the tension in his jaw. "You're carrying my child. This isn't about what you want." "Yes, it is," she said, her voice firmer now. "Because if I stay, I need more than a roof and security systems. I need to be seen, Ethan, not as a responsibility, not as a problem to solve. As a woman, you want to be here." He stepped closer, but there was no heat in it this time. "You're asking for something I can't give." She swallowed against the ache in her throat. "Then you're asking me to live in a place where I'll slowly disappear." Silence pressed in around them. His hand twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach for her, but couldn't make himself do it. "When will you leave?" he asked finally. "Tonight," she said, though the word felt like it was pulling something from her chest. She packed quickly, not much, just what she'd brought, folded neatly into a small suitcase. She avoided the living room where he stood, staring out at the city like it might give him an answer. When she reached the door, she paused. Her fingers tightened around the handle, but she didn't look back. I wanted you to fight for me, she said softly, even just once. She left before she could see whether her words landed. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened into the lobby, she stepped out into the cool night air, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The mist swallowed her quickly, the lights blurring into soft halos as she walked away from the building. Above her, in the glass tower, Ethan remained still and silent, watching the city from a place she would no longer call home. The coastal town was nothing like Manhattan. The air smelled faintly of salt. The streets were quiet enough to hear your footsteps, and the ocean seemed to stretch endlessly, as though it might swallow every sharp memory if you stared long enough. Layla found a small apartment above a cafe, its windows looking toward the harbor. The rent was modest, the furniture worn but clean, and the sound of the waves at night was a lullaby she hadn't realized she needed. She kept busy. Mornings were spent helping in the cafe downstairs, brewing coffee, wiping down tables, smiling at strangers who didn't know her name or past. In the afternoons, she worked on designs, the hum of her sewing machine blending with the cries of gulls outside. In the evenings, she would walk along the beach, her coat buttoned tight against the wind, her hands resting lightly over the curve of her belly. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was hers. Weeks passed before she allowed herself to think about him. Even then, it came in flashes. A particular turn of the tide, the glint of a cufflink in a shop window, a voice in a crowd that made her chest tighten before she realized it wasn't his. She told herself she had left him behind, but the truth was more complicated. Some part of her still carried him, the heat of his gaze, the weight of his hands, the way his voice had dipped when he said her name. It was raining the day he found her. The cafe was nearly empty, the few customers huddled over their mugs as the storm battered the windows. Layla was behind the counter, humming softly as she dried cups, when the door opened. She didn't look up at first. The bell above the frame chimed softly, and a gust of cold air swept through. She turned to greet the customer and froze. Ethan stood in the doorway, rain dripping from the shoulders of his coat, his hair damp and slightly disheveled in a way she had never seen. His eyes found her instantly, scanning her face with an intensity that seemed to pull the air from the room. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He crossed the space between them with measured steps, his gaze never leaving hers. "You weren't easy to find," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You shouldn't have looked," she replied, her hands tightening around the cloth. "Did you think I wouldn't?" She didn't answer. The air between them was charged, but not with the sharpness of their last conversation. This was different, slower, heavier, threaded with something she couldn't name. Ethan's eyes dropped briefly to her belly, now more prominent beneath her sweater. He swallowed, his jaw working to keep words from spilling too quickly. "You left without telling me where you were going, without letting me know you were safe." "I'm fine," she said. "You're not fine," he countered, his voice tightening. "You're alone, and you're carrying my child." The cafe door swung open as another customer entered, shaking water from his umbrella. The spell broke. Layla stepped back, motioning toward the corner. "We can't do this here." They ended up in her small apartment upstairs, the sound of the storm filling the space between their words. Ethan stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, while Layla leaned against the counter, keeping the island between them. "I didn't come here for a fight," he said. "I came because—" He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the glass. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, about all the things I didn't say." Layla's throat tightened. "You had your chance, Ethan. I waited for you to fight for me. You didn't. I'm fighting now." He turned toward her, and she saw it for the first time since he arrived. The crack in his composure, the faint tremor in the armor he wore so easily. Maybe I'm late. Maybe I don't know how to do this the way you need me to, but I'm not leaving without you. The words landed somewhere deep, in a place she had tried to seal off. Outside, the storm raged on, but the air was still inside, as though the world was waiting to see what she would say. The storm didn't let up for hours. Rain hammered against the windows of Layla's small apartment, wind rattling the glass until it felt like the whole building might sway. The dim light from the street lamps outside flickered and guttered, throwing the room into momentary shadow. Ethan was still by the window, his tall frame outlined against the shifting light, his gaze following the restless sea in the distance. Layla sat on the couch, her hands curled around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. The air between them was taut, not with anger this time, but with all the words that hadn't yet been spoken. "You can't just appear in my life like this," she said, quiet but steady. "Not after everything." He turned to face her, his eyes dark but unflinching. "I know I should have come sooner. I know I should have." He paused, searching for the right words. "Made it clear you were more than an obligation to me." She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth seeping into her skin, but not reaching the cold place in her chest. "Layla," he said softly, stepping closer, "I don't want you to do this alone. And I'm not talking about the baby. I mean you. I want to be there for you if you'll let me." Before she could reply, a sharp pain gripped her lower abdomen, sudden and fierce enough to make her gasp. The mug slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a muted thud. "Layla?" Ethan's voice shifted instantly, sharp, urgent. She tried to speak, but another wave of pain doubled her over. Her breath came fast, uneven. Panic threaded through her as she pressed a hand to her stomach. "Something's wrong," she whispered. He was already moving, crouching in front of her, his hands steady, but his eyes betraying the fear that had seized him. "We're going to the hospital. Now." The next few minutes blurred. He grabbed her coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, and swept her into his arms before she could protest. The rush of the storm swallowed them as they stepped outside, rain lashing against his back as he carried her to the car. Everything moved too quickly at the hospital. Nurses, monitors, the sterile scent of antiseptic. Layla was taken into a room, her coat and sweater replaced with a thin gown, her vitals checked. Questions asked in low, efficient voices. Ethan stayed close, one hand gripping the bed rail as if to anchor himself. When the doctor arrived, her tone was calm but serious. "It could be preterm contractions. We need to monitor you closely for the next several hours." Layla nodded, but her eyes drifted to Ethan. He was pale under the harsh hospital lights, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on her as though afraid she might vanish if he looked away. Once the room was cleared, she reached for his hand. It was warm, solid, grounding. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. His eyes snapped to hers. "I'm not going anywhere." For a long time, neither spoke. The monitors beeped steadily, the rain tapped against the window, and the quiet hum of the hospital filled the spaces between their breaths. "I was terrified," he admitted, his voice low, rough. "When you doubled over like that, I thought—" He shook his head, unable to finish. "You've never said that before," she murmured. "Because I've never felt it before," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Not like this." Something shifted then, not in a grand, sweeping way, but in the quiet weight of the moment. For the first time, she saw not the untouchable CEO, Not the man who had calculated every move, but someone stripped down to something raw and human. When the pain eased and the monitors confirmed the contractions had stopped, relief washed through them both. But neither of them moved from where they sat, her hand still in his, the storm outside softening. It was as if the night had taken them apart, just to put them back together, differently, imperfectly, but closer than they had been in a long time. The hospital room had fallen into a fragile kind of quiet. The storm outside had thinned to a soft drizzle, its rhythm against the window almost hypnotic. Layla lay propped against the pillows, her color returning, her breathing steadier. The monitors beside her glowed in gentle pulses, each beep a reassurance that the crisis was passing. Ethan hadn't moved from the chair beside her bed since the pain had eased. His posture was relaxed in appearance only. Beneath the stillness was a tension that held him like a vice. One hand rested on the armrest, the other on hers, his thumb drawing slow, deliberate circles over her skin, as if to remind himself she was still there. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Layla stared at the faint reflection of the two of them in the darkened window. The image felt strange, foreign. A man who'd once seemed so distant, now tethered to her side, as if the thought of leaving was unbearable. She broke the silence first. "You didn't have to stay all night." His eyes shifted to hers, sharp and unyielding. "Do you honestly think I could leave you like that?" "I don't know," she said softly. "There was a time when I would have." The words landed heavier than she meant them to, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze steady and searching. "I've made mistakes with you," he admitted, "more than I want to count. I told myself it was better to keep my distance, to keep control. But tonight," his voice broke off for a moment, as if the memory of her doubled over in pain was still too raw. "Tonight made me realize something." She waited, her fingers tightening slightly around his. "I can't imagine a life without you in it." The confession was quiet, almost hesitant, but it hung in the air with a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Ethan, I'm not saying I have all the answers," he continued, his tone firmer now, as if pushing through the last of his resistance. "I don't know how to do this perfectly, but I'm done pretending you're just someone I need to protect because of the baby. You're more than that. You've always been more than that." Her chest tightened, warmth and caution warring inside her. "You don't have to say things you don't mean just because of what happened tonight." He leaned closer, his eyes holding hers with a fierce clarity. "I mean every word. And I'm telling you this now because I can't risk you walking away again, thinking I don't care." Silence settled between them again, but this time it was softer. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the dangerous thought that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. She turned her hand in his, threading their fingers together. "If you want me to believe that, Ethan, you have to show me. Not just when things go wrong. Every day." His expression shifted, something like relief flickering through it. "Then, let me try." There was no grand gesture, no sweeping kiss under the glow of city lights. Just his hand tightening around hers, his presence solid beside her, and the unspoken promise in his eyes that maybe, for the first time, he wouldn't let fear decide for him. Outside, the rain had stopped. The first pale hints of dawn crept along the horizon, painting the edges of the window in muted gold. Layla watched the light spread slowly across the room, and for the first time in months, she let herself believe in the possibility of something new. Not perfect, not without its fractures, but real. And maybe that was enough to begin again. Spring came slowly to the city, as if it too had been holding its breath through the long winter. The trees outside Ethan's penthouse window were beginning to show their first pale green leaves, and the sunlight poured through the glass in a way that made everything feel newly possible. Layla stood in the kitchen, barefoot, her hair loose over her shoulders, slicing fresh fruit for breakfast. The scent of strawberries filled the air. She glanced up when she heard him enter, his tie undone, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't speak right away, just crossed the space between them and pressed a light kiss to her temple, his hand brushing against the small of her back in a gesture that felt so natural now. She almost forgot there had been a time when it hadn't existed. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning," she replied, smiling faintly. It had been 3 months since the night in the hospital. 3 months since he'd told her he couldn't imagine a life without her. And in those months, Ethan hadn't returned to the man she'd known before. The man who measured emotions like risk factors and kept his heart locked away. He showed up. Not just in the significant ways, doctor's appointments, late-night cravings, setting aside time from meetings so he could walk with her in the park, but in the small ones too. Listening without distraction and remembering her favorite tea. She reached for her hand when they crossed the street. The baby was due in a few weeks, and the apartment had transformed in ways neither of them had planned. A living room corner now held a bassinet, and soft blankets were folded neatly beside it. The study had been rearranged to make space for a rocking chair. It was still Ethan's world of order and precision, but now there were traces of her everywhere. Fabrics draped over chairs, sketches pinned to the wall, a vase of fresh flowers she changed every week. After breakfast, they found themselves on the balcony that morning, and the city spread out beneath them. The air was crisp, the sky a soft blue. Ethan stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she teased. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "About us. About what comes next." She turned to look at him, her heart picking up a beat. "What do you mean?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, to the way his gaze held hers without wavering. "I don't want to wait," he said. "Not for the perfect timing, not for the perfect plan. I want you. I want this. Our family, our life, forever." When he opened the box, the diamond caught the sunlight and scattered it across her fingers. But it wasn't the ring that stole her breath, but the look in his eyes. There was no hesitation there now, no calculation, only certainty. "Yes," she whispered, the word catching in her throat before she could stop it. He slid the ring onto her finger, and she stepped into his arms, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart under her cheek. The city roared softly below them, but only the two were up here at that moment, and the promise of everything was still to come. When their baby arrived weeks later, the world shifted again. The first time Ethan held their child, his entire face changed. The hardness that had once been a shield dissolving into something unshakably tender. Layla watched him, knowing that this man, this moment, was what she had been waiting for. They had come a long way from the night they met in that crowded hotel lounge. There had been storms, silences, and fractures that felt impossible to mend. But now, standing together with their child between them, they knew they had built something real. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. And in the years to come, through sleepless nights and bright mornings, through the unexpected and the ordinary, they would keep choosing each other. Because love, they'd learned, wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking together and still finding a way to hold on. If this story touched you, if you felt every heartbeat and every pause, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like this video, Please share it with someone who believes in second chances, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next story that might stay with you long after it ends. Your voice keeps these stories alive.